I'd like to start this morning the same way I started yesterday. Happy Lent. It is such a great season to be in the midst of, and we have had a beautiful, beautiful visit to Memphis. Coming yesterday, and really, I don't take naps, and after I ate the waffle and sausage and the Boston cream pie, which is my favorite Lenten dessert, went back to the hotel and stayed in somewhat of a coma for about an hour before we headed out to see the beautiful house that so many folks in Memphis with Sandra are opening, a house for 5 women to come in off the streets here in their efforts, and to talk to Eileen for hours, who has been an amazing host along with Chris and everybody here at Calvary, to tell us about some of their plans for working with programming for the women and maybe some social enterprise and ventures. And then we came back here last night to do a series on Magdalene and Thistle Farms and sold a lot of products. We're needing about maybe $500 or $600 more worth of product to do better here than we did in Birmingham, your former home. We'll see how that goes after this. But on behalf of the whole entourage here that came up from Nashville, Russ and Maddie and Charmaine and Christy and our Magdalene graduates, Jennifer and Doris, thank you. You are embodying the gospel, embodying what we're talking about being a welcoming community that brings people along with you into an open place, and we are grateful. So it has been a happy Lent. It is a continuation of this hope that started in Epiphany with the Sermon on the Mount about how we can live deeply into our faith. And yesterday I talked about the very first person we meet in the Gospel of John on our Lenten journey in the readings we're given for this season is Nicodemus, and how he teaches us about intimacy on the journey of healing. John's gospel goes on for the next 3 or 4 weeks in Lent to introduce us to the other characters that remind us of the characters that we need, the characteristics we need to live deeply into our faith, to not be playing church, to be able to love each other with our whole hearts, minds, and spirits, and love our neighbors as ourselves. The very first person Jesus introduces us to after Nicodemus is the woman at the well. He encounters her, this woman that we all know, not just from the world, but from our own hearts. We know shame and we know brokenness. We know what the world can do to us when it judges us fairly harshly, and we know how we have failed our own ideals in this world. And yet she still comes to the well to figure out a way to quench her thirst, and Jesus meets her there. It's a beautiful story that reminds us in the woman of the well that you and I can still be hopeful and idealistic in this world. That beyond all else, we do not kill hope in one another or the possibility that our being present can change a life. That is so idealistic, not in a Pollyannic way, but in a way that is really the inheritance of our faith. Now, before we came here, we were in Ecuador for a week, helping 3 women establish their social enterprise. They have a brand new building. It was given in honor and memory of Audrey's mom, who was one of the deacons here in Memphis. And it is a beautiful space, and the women were sewing and they're making things, this small group of women. And Jennifer went on her very first trip, who's here with us in Memphis today, was on the trip to Ecuador with us. First trip overseas ever. Jennifer's story is very similar to many of the women I serve at Magdalene. First abused between the ages of 7 and 11. Addiction, poverty, and all the things that call us to the streets. And somewhere along the way, decades later, she made her way into a sanctuary, into a church. She made her way into a well where we are promised we can drink and that our thirst can be sated. She made her way in Ohio into this Catholic church where a priest listened to her confession and said, I just read an article about a place that might help you. Magdalene in Nashville, Tennessee. And Jennifer, not knowing anyone, was like the woman at the well, ran towards that hope, made her way to Nashville, graduated a couple years ago, and has been speaking about hope and is unable to contain herself as much as the woman on the well. So she goes to Ecuador, first time to see that world and that life, and meets the women, and she weeps anew. I forgot how many women are out there so thirsty, so broken. In one of her very first reflections, she says, I promise you, I will never take water that is clean for granted again. How often we get used to these graces that we have and this water, real and spiritual, that we find, and forget this space that we can go out into the world, like the woman at the well that we know, in us, and speak of hope and truth and say, we'll never take this grace for granted. We will never take the love we have found for granted again, and preach it with the truth that we know. And the disciples keep going, and Jesus keeps going, past Nicodemus, past the woman at the well, and the very next character we are introduced to is the blind man in the 9th chapter. And that lesson, truly on this spiritual journey, the characteristic we need is humility. These issues that we're talking about, this world that we are facing, it is huge. And our ability to confront these needs and these problems feels overwhelming sometimes, and it is humbling. And the disciples immediately want to know whose fault is this man is blind. And Jesus says the only culpability that you and I have on the spiritual journey in this world is whether or not we are willing to respond with compassion. That's the culpability that we carry on this journey, and it humbles us. And so Jesus faces it. And all he has is dirt and spit. How humbling is that? And he turns it into a healing salve. That's what we're given. We're given the ability to remember we have what we need to respond to the suffering in the world, as humble as it is. We may plant one field of lavender this year for women who want to know freedom and joy. We may open one house for 5 women who are coming off the streets and out from under bridges and from out of prison, to offer them the hope of sanctuary. That may all happen right here in our community. And in proportion to the 100,000 people who are human trafficked, it is so small and humbling, but it is how we are called to respond. And then the next week of Lent, the next character we meet is Lazarus. Isn't that unbelievable? These are such beautiful and powerful readings through this whole season that are going to give us the characteristics we need to live a faith that has integrity and that pulls us together. And so he ends this before he turns his sights to Jerusalem on Lazarus, where the only people left are the community of faith. Everybody else has given up. We know what 4 days dead looks like. We know what 4 days dead smells like. And we know what it is for communities, judicial systems, educational systems, foster care systems to give up. And many times for the women I have been serving for the last 20 years at Magdalene, the only communities left is a community of faith, still wailing outside the grave, hoping beyond hope. And Jesus comes in and weeps at the pain and the suffering of it, weeps at the brokenness of it, and finds new life. When we got to our new building at Thistle Stop Café, the week after we got the building, there was a huge flood in Nashville, Tennessee, and it flooded the ground part of the building. And we renovated and restored one part, and one part stayed just devastated for years, for 2.5 years. I don't know if you've pulled up carpet 2.5 years after a flood, but it is way beyond 4 days dead, way beyond. And it's like, let's get a volunteer group in here. I'm not touching it. That's a youth group activity if I ever saw it. It seemed like it was going to be too much. We are a small organization, and when we applied for a grant, the feedback I got was, sometimes in our lives of faith, less is more. Why are you expanding into a whole nother part of the building when you are still not making money on the first part? I can tell you why. We have 100 women on our waiting list. There are women that are literally dying on the streets. It looks 4 days dead sometimes, and it's too much, and that's the place you still have to go. And thank God for people who are idealistic like the woman in the well. Thank God for people who confront a blind man and are humble enough to keep going. Thank God for the people who share Nicodemus' journey of intimacy with the Lord, who want to stand with you. Thank God for a community of faith who stand by the grave and say, there may be life yet. About 150 people got together and raised about $200,000 this year. And almost 6 months ago, opened the Thistle Stop Café. It's a transformation from a dead, nasty, moldy space to chandeliers built with teacups from survivors from all over the world, with a hardwood floor 150 years old from Al Gore Sr.'s warehouse, laid by a group of contractors who gave their Saturdays. Tables from women who want to be remembered in this space by their children and friends. It is what community does the best. Love lavishly and love richly with meaning, and it restores life. So much so that once we opened the cafe, the first barista trained was a woman who stepped out from underneath a tree. She had no belongings, nothing in her life. She was living under a tree. And she came to Magdalene, and she celebrated 10 years clean as we opened the cafe. Never had a job, has always been on disability. 100% disability in the city of Nashville. Fell in love being a barista. She won a contest. March 3rd through March 6th this year, she was flown to Dallas, Texas to receive the master's training in barista. People walk into the cafe, and it's not all the things I described that makes people weep. It is Terry's smile. Once dead and abandoned and forgotten, there is new joy and new life, and you can't help but catch it. I think after the disciples, after you and I meet Nicodemus and the woman at the well and the blind man, and after we meet Lazarus, new life. Pray to God at the end of this season we are ready to enter Jerusalem. Grateful, broken, with new hope and humility, so that we can love again and again and again until we get it right.